My name is Alex, and I'm 28 years old living in Denver, Colorado. I never thought a simple Thanksgiving invitation would lead to the biggest financial decision of my life. 2 days before the holiday, my mother called me with her usual dismissive tone. "Alex, we've decided you're just too dramatic for Thanksgiving this year. Maybe it's better if you stay home and work on yourself." The casual cruelty in her voice was nothing new, but this time something inside me snapped. Growing up as the youngest of 3 children in suburban Denver was like living in a constant competition I never knew I was losing. My older siblings, Marcus and Elena, were the golden children who could do no wrong. Marcus was the star athlete who got a full scholarship to Colorado State, while Elena was the academic prodigy who graduated valedictorian and went to medical school. Then there was me, the family disappointment who chose art school over business, creativity over conformity. My parents, Robert and Patricia Williams, were successful real estate agents who measured worth in dollar signs and social status. Our house in Cherry Hills Village was their pride and joy, a testament to their success that they never let anyone forget. Growing up, every conversation somehow circled back to property values, investment opportunities, and maintaining appearances. Love in the Williams household came with conditions and price tags. I still remember my 16th birthday when my parents gave me a used Honda Civic while Marcus got a brand new BMW for his 18th. When I pointed out the disparity, my father just shrugged and said Marcus had earned it with his football achievements. Elena received a new MacBook Pro for getting into medical school, while I had to work part-time jobs throughout college to afford basic supplies for my art classes. The pattern continued into adulthood. When Marcus needed help with his mortgage, after his divorce, my parents immediately stepped in with a substantial loan. When Elena wanted to open her private practice, they co-signed for her business loan without hesitation. But when I asked for help with my student loans after graduation, they lectured me about personal responsibility and the consequences of choosing an impractical career path. Despite their constant criticism, I kept trying to win their approval. I worked multiple jobs to establish my graphic design business, slowly building a client base and reputation. By 25, I was financially stable and even successful by most standards. I had my own apartment in downtown Denver, a growing portfolio of corporate clients, and enough savings to consider buying a house. But none of that seemed to matter to my parents. Family gatherings became exercises in endurance. Every holiday was an opportunity for subtle digs about my lifestyle choices. "Why don't you get a real job at a corporation?" my mother would ask while serving dinner. "When are you going to settle down and give us grandchildren like your siblings?" my father would add, conveniently ignoring that both Marcus and Elena were divorced and childless themselves. The criticism extended beyond career choices. My parents disapproved of my friends, my apartment location, my car, even my clothing choices. Nothing I did was ever quite right, quite successful enough, quite normal enough for their standards. I was too creative, too sensitive, too different from the mold they had cast for their children. Last year, I made what I thought was a grand gesture to prove my love and success. My parents had been complaining about their aging SUV for months, dropping hints about needing a new vehicle but claiming they couldn't afford the payments. I had been saving for a down payment on a house, but instead, I decided to surprise them with a brand new Toyota Highlander for Christmas. The car cost $38,000, nearly wiping out my savings account. Their reaction was lukewarm, at best. "Oh, that's nice, dear," my mother had said, barely looking up from her phone. "I hope you kept the receipt in case we need to exchange it for something more practical." My father inspected the vehicle like he was looking for defects, commenting that the color wasn't quite what he would have chosen. There was no gratitude, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice I had made, just criticism disguised as practicality. The months following the car purchase were financially tight for me. I had to take on extra freelance projects, work longer hours, and postpone my house hunting plans. Meanwhile, my parents drove their new car to family events, never once mentioning my gift or thanking me publicly. When relatives complimented their new vehicle, they would simply say they had finally upgraded, as if they had purchased it themselves. This pattern of taking my contributions for granted while dismissing my worth became the norm. When Elena needed help moving into her new practice space, I spent an entire weekend hauling furniture and equipment. When Marcus wanted professional headshots for his real estate business, I provided them for free. But when I invited them to my first solo art exhibition, they claimed to be too busy with more important commitments. The breaking point came 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I had been looking forward to the holiday, hoping for a peaceful family, gathering where we could focus on gratitude rather than grievances. I had even volunteered to bring dessert and help with preparations. That's when my mother called with her devastating announcement about my dramatic nature, making me unwelcome at their table. The accusation of being too dramatic was particularly cruel because it invalidated every legitimate concern I had ever raised about their treatment. When I pointed out favoritism, I was being dramatic. When I expressed hurt about being excluded or dismissed, I was being too sensitive. The label was their way of avoiding accountability while making me question my own perceptions and feelings. After hanging up the phone, I sat in my apartment staring at the city lights, processing what had just happened. My own parents had uninvited me from Thanksgiving, not because of any specific incident or argument, but because my personality was apparently too much for them to handle during their holiday celebration. The rejection cut deeper than any previous, slight because it felt so final, so absolute. I spent Thanksgiving alone, ordering Chinese takeout and working on a freelance project to distract myself from the loneliness. Social media was torture, filled with families gathered around dinner tables, expressing gratitude for their loved ones. I wondered what my family was saying about my absence, whether they even noticed the empty chair at their table, whether they felt any guilt about their decision to exclude me. The weekend after Thanksgiving brought an unexpected revelation. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, mentioned seeing my parents at the grocery store bragging about their new car to anyone who would listen. She innocently asked if I had helped them pick it out, since she knew I had good taste. The casual conversation made me realize that my parents were taking credit for my gift, while simultaneously treating me as unworthy of their company. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the Toyota dealership where I had purchased the car, explaining that I needed to discuss the financing arrangement. The sales manager, Jennifer, remembered me well since I had paid cash for the vehicle. She was surprised when I explained that I was considering repossessing the car due to family circumstances. Technically, since I had purchased the car and it was titled in my name, I had every legal right to reclaim it. The dealership could facilitate the repossession for a fee, and they would handle all the logistics. Jennifer was professional but clearly curious about the unusual situation. She explained that repossession typically happened when someone defaulted on payments, not when the purchaser voluntarily reclaimed a gift. The decision wasn't made lightly. I spent hours weighing the consequences, knowing that taking back the car would create a permanent rift with my parents. But I also realized that the relationship was already broken, had perhaps never been whole to begin with. They had shown me repeatedly that my value to them was purely transactional, based on what I could provide rather than who I was as a person. I scheduled the repossession for the following Tuesday, giving myself time to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The plan was simple. The tow truck would arrive at my parents' house, present the legal documentation, and remove the vehicle. I would be at work, maintaining plausible deniability about the exact timing while having an alibi for my whereabouts. Monday night, I barely slept. Part of me hoped my parents would call, would somehow acknowledge their mistake and invite me back into the family fold. But my phone remained silent, confirming that their Thanksgiving celebration had proceeded without any thought of reconciliation. Their indifference strengthened my resolve to follow through with the repossession. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, typical November weather in Denver. I went to work as usual, but my concentration was shot. Every phone notification made, my heart race, wondering if the repossession had happened, if my parents had discovered what I had done. Around noon, my phone finally rang with my mother's number displayed on the screen. "Alex, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded without any greeting. "There are men here trying to take our car. They're saying you ordered a repossession. This is absolutely ridiculous." I could hear my father's voice in the background, equally agitated, demanding to speak with whoever was in charge of this obvious mistake. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the conversation I had been rehearsing in my mind. "Mom, the car was a gift that I purchased with my own money. Since you've made it clear that I'm too dramatic to be part of this family, I've decided to reclaim my property." The silence on the other end was deafening, broken only by muffled conversation as she apparently covered the phone to speak with my father. "You cannot be serious," she finally said, her voice rising to a pitch I rarely heard. "This is our car. We've been driving it for months. You gave it to us. What will people think if they see it being towed away?" The concern about appearances was so typically my mother, more worried about neighborhood gossip than the underlying family dysfunction that had led to this moment. I explained calmly that the car was titled in my name, purchased with my money, and therefore legally mine to reclaim. The gift had been given in the context of a loving family relationship, but since they had made it clear that I was unwelcome in that family, the circumstances had changed. My father grabbed the phone at this point, his voice booming with indignation. "This is extortion," he shouted. "You're holding our transportation hostage because you didn't get invited to one dinner. This is exactly the kind of dramatic behavior we were trying to avoid." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. They were calling my response to their rejection dramatic, while simultaneously having a meltdown over losing a car they had never paid for. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with both parents alternating between anger, guilt-tripping, and attempts at negotiation. They offered to invite me to Christmas dinner, to take me out for a make-up Thanksgiving meal, to acknowledge my generosity more publicly. But their offers felt hollow, motivated by the loss of their vehicle rather than any genuine desire to repair our relationship. I remained firm in my decision, explaining that this wasn't about one dinner invitation, but about years of being treated as less than, of having my contributions taken for granted, while my worth as a person was consistently questioned. The car repossession was simply the natural consequence of their decision to exclude me from the family. If I wasn't family enough for Thanksgiving, I wasn't family enough to provide them with expensive gifts. The call ended with my mother in tears and my father threatening legal action, though we both knew he had no grounds for a lawsuit. I sat at my desk afterward, hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in my adult life, I had set a boundary with my parents and enforced it despite their emotional manipulation. The repossession was completed that afternoon. Jennifer from the dealership called to confirm that the vehicle had been successfully retrieved and was back in their possession. She mentioned that my parents had been quite upset, but had ultimately cooperated with the process once the legal documentation was presented. The car would be detailed and could be resold, or I could keep it for myself. I decided to keep the Toyota, trading in my older Honda for the newer model. It felt symbolic somehow, reclaiming not just the vehicle, but also my right to make decisions about my own resources without being guilted or manipulated. The car that had been intended as a gesture of love became a symbol of self-respect and boundary setting. The aftermath was predictably dramatic, though not from me. My siblings called within hours, having been recruited by my parents to intervene in what they saw as my unreasonable behavior. Marcus was incredulous, unable to understand why I would take back a gift over something as trivial as a holiday invitation. Elena was more analytical, trying to negotiate a compromise that would restore family harmony without addressing the underlying issues. Both conversations followed similar patterns. They acknowledged that our parents could be difficult, but insisted that family was more important than pride. They reminded me of all the times our parents had helped them, conveniently forgetting that I had never received similar support. They suggested I was overreacting, being too sensitive, letting my emotions cloud my judgment. The same dismissive language I had heard my entire life. I explained to both siblings that this wasn't about the car or even about Thanksgiving specifically. It was about being consistently treated as less valuable, less worthy of respect and consideration than the rest of the family. The car repossession was simply me refusing to continue subsidizing people who didn't value my presence in their lives. If they wanted the benefits of having me as family, they needed to treat me like family. Neither sibling seemed to grasp the deeper issues at play. They were focused on the dramatic gesture of taking back the car, rather than the years of subtle rejection and dismissal that had led to that moment. Their inability to see beyond the surface level confirmed that the family dysfunction ran deeper than just my parents' behavior. It was a system that everyone participated in, consciously or not. The days following the repossession brought a steady stream of communication from various family members. Aunts and uncles who rarely contacted me suddenly had opinions about my behavior. Cousins emerged from social media silence to lecture me about forgiveness and family loyalty. The coordinated response suggested that my parents had been working the phones, sharing their version of events and rallying support for their position. What struck me most about these conversations was how little anyone asked about my perspective or feelings. The assumption seemed to be that I had acted irrationally and needed to be talked back into compliance. No one questioned why my parents had uninvited me from Thanksgiving, or whether their treatment of me over the years might have contributed to my decision. The focus was entirely on my response, rather than their actions. I began to understand that the family dynamic I had grown up with wasn't just about my parents' favoritism toward my siblings. It was a broader system where certain people's feelings and perspectives mattered more than others, where maintaining peace was more important than addressing injustice, where the person who spoke up about problems was seen as the problem rather than the symptom of deeper issues. 2 weeks after the repossession, my parents made their final attempt at reconciliation. They showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking haggard and desperate. My mother had been crying, her makeup smeared, and her usual perfect appearance disheveled. My father looked older somehow, as if the stress of the situation had aged him rapidly. They asked to come in, to talk things through like adults. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time in my memory, my parents listened without immediately dismissing or minimizing my concerns. They acknowledged that they had treated me differently from my siblings, though they framed it as having different expectations rather than showing favoritism. They admitted that uninviting me from Thanksgiving had been harsh and unnecessary. However, their apologies came with conditions and justifications. They were sorry I felt hurt, but I needed to understand their perspective. They had been trying to avoid family drama during the holiday, not deliberately exclude me. They had always been proud of my success, even if they didn't express it the way I wanted. The car repossession had embarrassed them in front of the neighbors and made them look ungrateful. I listened to their explanations, recognizing the familiar pattern of partial accountability mixed with deflection. They were willing to acknowledge some wrongdoing, but only in the context of my overreaction being equally problematic. There was no recognition that years of dismissive treatment had led to this moment, no understanding that their behavior had consequences beyond their immediate intentions. When they finished speaking, I shared my own perspective calmly and clearly. I explained how their constant criticism and dismissal had affected my self-worth, how being excluded from family events had made me feel unwanted and unloved, how their taking my generosity for granted had felt like exploitation. I told them that I loved them but could no longer accept being treated as a second-class family member. Their response was telling. My mother immediately became defensive. insisting that they had never meant to make me feel that way, that I was misinterpreting their actions through an overly sensitive lens. My father was more direct, stating that every family had its dynamics, and I needed to accept my role rather than trying to change everyone else. Neither response suggested any real understanding of my experience or willingness to change their behavior. The meeting ended with an impasse. They wanted me to return the car and resume our previous relationship dynamic, pretending that nothing had changed. I wanted acknowledgement of the harm they had caused and concrete changes in how they treated me going forward. Neither side was willing to compromise on their fundamental position, making reconciliation impossible under the current circumstances. As they left my apartment, my mother turned back with one final attempt at manipulation. "You're going to regret this, Alex. Family is all you have in the end, and you're throwing it away over pride." Her words were meant to instill fear and guilt, to make me question my decision and come crawling back. Instead, they confirmed that I had made the right choice in setting boundaries. The months that followed were difficult, but ultimately liberating. I had to rebuild my social support system, relying more heavily on friends and chosen family rather than biological relatives. The holidays were lonely at first, but I gradually created new traditions that brought me joy rather than stress. I volunteered at a local shelter on Thanksgiving, finding more genuine gratitude and connection there than I had ever experienced at family gatherings. My business continued to grow, partly because I was no longer constantly distracted by family, drama, and financial requests. Without the pressure to prove myself worthy of my parents' love, I could focus on work that fulfilled me rather than just impressed others. I started dating again, this time with healthier boundaries and a clearer sense of my own worth. The car became a daily reminder of my decision to prioritize self-respect over family approval. Every time I drove it, I remembered the moment I chose to value myself enough to reclaim what was mine. It wasn't about the money or the vehicle itself, but about refusing to be taken for granted by people who claimed to love me while treating me as disposable. 6 months after the repossession, I received a text from Elena asking if I was ready to apologize and move on. The assumption that I owed an apology for standing up for myself was so typical of our family dynamic that I almost laughed. I responded that I was open to rebuilding our relationship when everyone was ready to acknowledge the real issues and commit to change, not just sweep everything under the rug. That text exchange was the last communication I had with any immediate family member. The silence was initially painful, confirming my worst fears about being truly alone in the world. But gradually, it became peaceful. Without the constant stress of managing difficult family relationships, I had energy for pursuits and people that actually brought joy to my life. I joined a hiking group, took cooking classes, started volunteering regularly at the animal shelter. I made friends who valued my creativity and sensitivity rather than seeing them as character flaws. I began dating someone who appreciated my artistic nature and supported my career choices. Slowly, I built a chosen family of people who actually wanted me around, not just when they needed something from me. The Toyota is still in my driveway, now with over 20,000 miles of adventures and new memories. It has taken me on camping trips with friends, to art shows in neighboring states, to visit the family I chose rather than the one I was born into. The car that was meant to buy my parents' love became the vehicle for discovering my own worth and building authentic relationships. Looking back, I realized that Thanksgiving phone call was a gift in disguise. My mother's casual cruelty and uninviting me finally gave me permission to stop trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it freely. The $38,000 surprise they received from the bank wasn't just about a repossessed car. It was about the cost of taking someone for granted for too long. If you're listening to this and recognizing patterns in your own family relationships, Know that you deserve better. You deserve to be valued for who you are, not just what you can provide. Setting boundaries isn't cruel or dramatic. It's necessary for your mental health and self-respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable toxic behavior, even when it comes from family. The road to healing isn't easy, and there are still days when I miss the idea of having a loving, supportive family. But I've learned that family isn't just about shared DNA. It's about mutual respect, genuine care, and showing up for each other consistently. The people in my life now may not share my last name, but they share my values and treat me with the love and respect I always deserved. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in struggling with difficult family dynamics. Remember, you have the power to choose who gets access to your time, energy, and resources. Use that power wisely, and don't be afraid to drive away from situations that don't serve your highest good, even if it means going alone for a while. Sometimes the most dramatic thing you can do is simply refuse to accept less than you deserve.